Greeting and welcome everyone to the 2024 REL Distinguished Lecture Series organized by the Department of Religious Study at the University of West. My name is Miroj Sake and I am a Chair and Associate Professor of Department of Religious Study. And today it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Ronald M. Davidson. Dr. Davidson is a Professor Emeritus of Religious Study at Fairfield University. He earned his PhD in Buddhist Studies at the University of California, Berkeley in 1985, specializing in Indian Yogacara philosophical problem. His primary research area focuses on Tantric Buddhism, Vajrayana, Mantrayana, particularly in medieval India and early Tibet. His publications include Indian Esoteric Buddhism, a social history of the Tantric movement, and Tibetan Renaissance, Tantric Buddhism in the rebirth of Tibetan culture, and dozens of specific studies on Tantric Buddhism in India and Tibet. His forthcoming chapter on Abhiṣekas in the Oxford Handbook of Tantric Studies is set to be published in 2025. The topic of today's lecture, Initiation, Abhiṣekas in Indian Buddhism. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ronald Davidson.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank Dr. Abhiṣekas, whose father I was privileged to know and whose mother hosted me when I was in Lady Tour once, and who has become a good friend and for whose manuscript preservation work I have great enthusiasm. I thank you for his gracious invitation here to present some uncoordinated thoughts I've had about a topic which I have already written on a few occasions, Abhiṣekas, the consecratory ritual of esoteric Buddhism. I most recently published the discussion of Indian Abhiṣeka in Indian Buddhism in the Oxford Handbook of Tantric Studies, which it was set to be published in 2025, but it just started shipping last week, and I was told this morning my copy arrived at my home. And it's now available for the astronomical price of $238. It's an enormous boat anchor of a book. It's about 1,300 pages. My article is thanks to the incessant harassment of Glenn Hayes and Richard Payne, who would give me no peace unless I agreed to write it. This here. And those who would care to read that article online, the online version through your library, or send me a request and I will return a Dropbox link and you can read it that way. I'm happy to do that for you, not a problem. All of this leads to the question of consecratory rituals, Abhiṣeka. Our general awareness of them is rather skewed by a number of factors, not the least of which is the presence of so many followers of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition in this country who have received Abhiṣeka, or Wangkur, now given worldwide for more than 50 years. The textual language of these rituals speaks of a close, there's the Oxford Handbook. The textual language of these rituals speaks of a close, intimate association of master and disciple. But the reality experienced is usually quite different, especially after the Dalai Lama has been initiating everyone and his dog beginning in the 1980s. According to the Dalai Lama's website, since 1985, there have been 34 massive Kala Chakra initiations in India. 5 at least claim to have had 200,000 and more persons, meaning that more than 1 million people have said to receive it. We currently see this process in Tibet and China as well, with a great Kala Chakra initiation in Lanzhou. Back in India, tour companies now run tours and AC buses to the secret Abhiṣeka of the Kala Chakra in the secret hidden tradition of Shambhala. They will need your credit card. Lest we think this entirely modern and anomalous, I have briefly discussed in one paper the Lamdre Dzogchen celebration in the 4th month in Tibet at Ngor Monastery, Ngore Womchiden, which imparts the Abhiṣeka of 5 mandalas during the great celebration of the Nirvana of Sajjan Nipo. At this event, Ngor Tartzik Khenpo told me that 300 or more pilgrims might come to be initiated 25 at a time, to abide by formal restrictions in the Vajra tradition. The transmission was in opposition to the Lamjik Lobche, given to actual close disciples, although still in a group setting. There were, to be sure, other grand Abhiṣeka in Tibet, such as the great Abhiṣeka for the Rinchen Terzi of Kontralo Chitaye, enduring over months. I'm sure there were other great consecratory rituals as well. But the modern world has moved the needle, as it were, so that now we can receive Abhiṣeka remotely without even meeting the master. Disembodied Abhiṣeka, as it were. So part of the problem then in understanding Indian Abhiṣeka is that we experience cognitive dissonance between the event described in Buddhist literature and the reality on the ground. Our expectation is in some measure the result of Tibetan, especially Gelugpa, emphasis on the Kala Chakra, so that the major Abhiṣeka manuals were like those like the Sikadishatika, which follow closely the sequence and systematization of the ritual of the Kala Chakra Tantra. A similar format is revealed in other Abhiṣeka texts, including the Vajravali, the Abhiṣeka Prakarana of Abhiyakara Gupta, along with those. These cover more than 24 mandalas. Their format includes issues foregrounded in the Kala Chakra tradition. Most such works clearly discuss rituals between a single master and a single disciple. Other earlier rituals, like that of the Nilambara Vajrapani or the Sri Paramaja, mention disciples in the plural, however. The recently published Anonymous Abhiṣeka Vidi, possibly written in Nepal, describes one, two, or many disciples receiving Abhiṣeka. And the earliest Abhiṣeka of all, for which we have evidence, was conferred between March 27 and April 4th of 651 by the Vajrasana master at Ikuta on a group of 16 Chinese monks and 12 Chinese aristocracy. We may observe that the Chinese record keeping is exemplary. There is no similar record keeping at all at any time in Indian history. Consequently, largish Abhiṣeka gatherings have precedent, even if none of these participants arrived by air-conditioned motor coaches. So even then we may ask one question I do not believe has been correctly answered. Why Abhiṣeka at all? Perhaps a bit of background. Abhiṣeka terminology had definite semantics. Two groups of verbs are employed with the Abhiṣeka. That of aspersion, Abhisinj, and the other terms, proksh and shna, employed as semantically equivalent. These all mean to bathe or sprinkle and are generally associated with vishuddha, indicating purity as the purpose. This idea extends from the Indian dedication to personal purity, taken to a point nowhere else observed by any other culture, as anyone who has ever been to India understands. The other set of verbs extends from the root su, indicate invivification, which is the term for the Vedic ceremony of consecration, Rajasuya, the quickening of the king. Now, I would tie this to the idea found in the Indian literature on the monsoon, the annual Abhiṣeka of the entire landscape in South and Southeast Asia, which invivifies the world into efflorescence and strength. This is associated also with Varchas, power and authority in Sanskrit. So the Chinese translators have generally translated the term Abhiṣeka, by Guangbing, see there, to sprinkle on the crown of the head, which is a literal description, invoking the first sense of the term, personal purification. Conversely, Tibetans have provided an interpretive translation, Wangkor, extending from the invivification through water in the Indian monsoon after the hot season. So you have a transfer of power. I've covered something of the semantics of these in my Oxford article. Now to the question, wherefore Abhiṣeka? I have generally made the argument that it reflects the militarization of India and the decline and collapse of late antiquity, which I still believe is the best interpretation of the evidence. But that fact tells us a little bit less than I had initially hoped, for it glosses over the disruption between Abhiṣeka and prior ritual literature. Now, it is certainly not the case that all Buddhists of the period believe Abhiṣeka to be the unique key for liberation in the manner that the later tantric scriptures describe. Let me give you an example in a text I've been obsessed with for the last 15 years, the Mahamani Vipuli Vimana, a 6th to 7th century Dharani text that promotes its own efficacy. By the power of this incantation, all of those beings, just by hearing it, or reading it, or comprehending it, or bear it on the body, or have it written and then carry it, or fasten it to the tip of a banner of victory, or inscribe it into a book, or write it on the painting on cloth, or write it on silk, or write it on a wall, or write it on a fence, or even as little as hearing the sound, or touching it on the head, or if a shadow of the incantation falls on the person, or if others in proximity touch it, all of those will, without a doubt, become irreversible. They will be complete, perfect Buddhas, awakening to the highest, complete, perfect awakening. Consequently, by the standards of this statement, because I'm touching the text and you are all in proximity to someone touching the text, well, you have all now become irreversible bodhisattvas destined for awakening. You are all welcome. Analogous statements are found in other Dharani texts and Dharani literature as well. The Karandi Vyuha, Sarvadurgi Parishodhana Dharani, the Ushnisha Vijaya Dharani, Sukhavati Vyuha, Sarvatagadadi Shana Vyuha, and so forth. So it is not unique by any stretch of the imagination. I actually had a Karma Lama in Bogai in 1988 read me an analogous section of a Dharani text, smile and tell me how easy the awakening was through this means. So the idea is not entirely dead in the modern world. Now, for those thinking this kind of statements is a soteriological sleight of hand, or that it foregrounds the image of nirvana as a contagious virus, I would agree. Doc, I was at the store and picked up a terrible case of nirvana. Can I get a shot? It is clear that this kind of broad, sweeping statement is a little bit like everyone getting a participation trophy in American grammar schools. It is deeply unsatisfying to the person and prompts suspicion and insecurity in many participants. That is, just because you by accident touch someone who has the text or has a shadow of the book fall on you, most of us would not immediately assume, awesome, I'm a Buddha now. I was going to go to the gym, but I guess I have other plans. There are other more substantive historical concerns as well, and we may observe that this Dharani doctrine of contagious awakening is not, in the language of social science and media studies, sticky. I'm going to use that term a lot. That is, it does not take hold and remain in use. Even though Tibetan prayer flags are mostly premised on such statements, that does not mean that they precipitate commitment and sociological transformation. We find a specific Sangha mentioned in the Gunegar copper plate inscription identified as the Avaivartika Bodhisattva Bhikshu Sangha, perhaps denoting that they were satisfied that their practice was in accordance with the scriptures assuring of them that status. But to my knowledge, this is a unique epigraph and not replicated elsewhere in the inscriptional record. Certainly, it did not stop the authors of the Tantras from affirming that their tradition was the only vehicle to obtain Buddhahood, thus preempting the rhetoric of the Dharani texts that preceded them, many of which made the same claim. Now, I would propose that this kind of Dharani language is not sticky in the way that we might expect, because it did not have the essential social and psychological functions necessary. Over the last century and a half, the distinction between structure and substance on one hand and function on the other has been a standard pedagogical and intellectual tool since the time of Emile Durkheim. Its encoded essential as binary structure is by many measures dissatisfactory, yet we have not been able to entirely stray from beyond its gravity, in part because it does tell us things about how aspects of religion work. And such functions are not entirely expressed in a flat, literal reading of the statements. In our instance, I would propose that when Buddhists heard they were already liberated through the stealth action of Dhananis, they found this eminently dissatisfactory, even if they employed it in an apotropaic realia like the prayer flags and amulets. I would suggest that the reason such proclamations were not so sticky is they did not engage the fundamental system of psychosocial transformation in India, ritual. In India, as is generally recognized, there is a consistent expectation that there must be some performative ritual to mark an alteration of soteriological status even if it is to guarantee liberation. The performance of a ritual is the epistemological source in its own right. The practice of the ritual is itself correct knowledge. This is in distinction to the idea of quote-unquote empty ritual, that the Protestant Christian requirement that the explicit intellectual and symbolic information can be attached to the ritual is more important than the ritual itself, a view lamentably accepted even now in Asia. Ritual furthermore narrativizes behavior so that memory and reflection is drawn back to the performative event. Much as we revisit music or dance in our memories, identifying through smell and other senses an intense experience. Within Buddhist background, the Shramana systems generally, moral action, ritual or not, presumes that psychological dedication, cetana, and some hard work is to be involved. Yet we may recall that the term karma semantically vacillates between karma as a moral action and karma as ritual action, indicating precedent and storyline for both. So we see that volition is moral action, from that arises vocal and physical karma in the Abhidharma Kosha, and in the Goya Samaja this is followed up by saying just inside this 12-cubit mandala, he should draw a wheel, circular, and then should impress the mudras with the ritual action, seen in the ritual of ground purification. Dhanani literature's ritual basis certainly developed over time, but part of the problem in our assessment of Dhananis is the late Indian reclassification of them as Kriya Tantra, which is the Tibetans somewhat reluctantly followed. A close reading of the Royal Dynastic Archive shows that Dhananis are sometimes considered esoteric and sometimes not. But even this obscures the realities that Dhananis are not at all secret. As late as the late 6th century, Dhanani texts like the Mogapasha Hriday, for example, reiterated that there should be no acharya mushti, no teacher's fist, differentiating between an inner group from an outer congregation, but they were to be distributed to all. Thus, Dhananis generally required no gateway ceremony, no ritual for their reception. They were to be distributed as widely as possible, for their magic was the Buddha's power encoded within the letters, the sounds, and the entire text. That power was liberative and was to be widely shared, no GRE or TOEFL exam required. So some form of Abhiṣeka consecration has been around for a lengthy period before the Tantric texts were written. I was asked today about origins of Tantrism. This is part of the deal, even if not in the manner ultimately employed in the Tantras. The festival of the Abhiṣeka consecration ritual of the Bodhi tree, for example, was well known in the earlier literature. There was a Bodhi festival called Bodhi Maha. Even applied to trees of the previous members of the 7 Buddhas, especially Kashyapa and Kanaka Muni. So the Sumangala Vilasini, those who wander to each of the pilgrimage sites of the life of the Buddha, sweeping the area before the stupa, washing the seats for people, and offering consecratory water to the Bodhi tree, nothing is to be said against them. They are to be honored. Buddhists already began to employ purificatory meditations, employing visualized Abhiṣekas, long before the 6th to 7th century, as we see in the texts from Central Asia in the anonymous and untitled work called Vaishlingla Yoga Lehrbook, as well as in works studied by Green. Then the yogin, oppressed by compassion, feels a hot black boil arise in the middle of his brow, and from his head emerges a mystical woman who anoints his body with streams of milk until the feeling is pacified. Then from his body the streams of milk emerge and inundate the ocean of all beings, so that the yogin sees the physical and mental anguish of beings thus being destroyed. This is a very interesting practice. A practice is used in Tantric Buddhism in terms of Vajrasattva practice. It's also found in Zen Buddhism when you find the Zen sickness of Hakuin. He undergoes a practice almost exactly like this. But none of these were tied directly to soteriology per se, even if they operate as aids to the path. Now, in an assessment of the functions of Abhiṣeka, we may begin with the observation that it is functionally very sticky, that we are now having a conversation about this ritual because it persists over time and space. Stickiness is a social science metaphor that is potentially circular in nature, but has been employed with effect to describe a number of social and economic facts that take hold in society and endure while others do not. Some social events tend to be sticky. Writing is sticky. Common values, hierarchies, rites of passage. And it is this latter that is one of the compelling arguments for the modeling of the stickiness of Abhiṣeka. That is, as a ritual of passage defining a social process rather different from reading a text in one's cave or even in a group, which is all that is required of most Dharani texts. Stickiness also means that we have to assume that the appropriation of language and ritual elements from Brahminical systems was done both of necessity once Buddhists began constructing ritual manuals, but also in a manner addressing Buddhists' own needs. We often hear of expedient means, upaya kaushalya, right? As a signum of homiletic enterprise, teaching appropriate to the appropriate audience. But in terms of ritual, we also must assume that ritual events are taken from the environment because those first employing them both believed in them and felt forced to acknowledge its Indian gravity drawing Buddhists into the system. So as I have mentioned elsewhere, overwhelmingly the systems from which these initiation rituals are drawn was the reduced Abhiṣekas of the supplemental Vedana literature, the specific class of literature of Vedic corpus, rather than the grand systems of the Shrauta or the Soma rituals associated with the actual overlord. Vedana supplemental ritual does not require 4 Brahmins, as the Shrauta or Soma ritual does, or the use of 3 fires, as we see in the multi-day systems of the Agnicayana or the larger Agnishtoma, for example. There were some latent traces of the Shrauta rites, which you can talk about if you like, but they were incidental to the process. This is an incomplete list suggesting the extent of the Parishishta and Vedana literature. These are the important ones. But there are others, and Parameshwara Aital has published a lengthy bibliography of Vedic supplemental literature. The employment of rituals grounded in the supplemental literature of the many Vedic schools follows very much in the manner that Buddhists adopted other ideological and ritual systems to their needs. They were very selective, ladies and gentlemen. They were very selective. Abhiṣeka, along with mandalas, homas, and other forms, became durable beyond that of some other Buddhist systems. So while there are rituals for the acceptance of the Bodhisattva vow, such as the Bodhisattva Samvara Samadhana and the Bodhisattva Bhumi, initially a self-standing ritual, it was in many lineages folded into other rituals, specifically attached either to the refuge ceremony or as a prelude to the acceptance of Abhiṣeka for lineages grounded in the esoteric tradition. We may want to ask why Abhiṣeka became such a signature rite, given that its premises are not always unfolded in accordance with either the claims of the literature or the representations of some teachers. It is common, for example, to receive more Abhiṣekas than one can possibly practice. I once knew an American monk who traveled to get every Abhiṣeka he could given during a specific decade, and received consecrations from more tantric traditions than he could possibly have practiced in 100 lifetimes. I've known Tibetan teachers in this country who insist that their disciples take this or that Abhiṣeka with a famous lama they invite, while the same disciples are never instructed in the practice with no intention of practicing it. When Khenpo Jigme Phuntsho visited Dharamshala in 1990, he reportedly gave and received Abhiṣekas with the Dalai Lama to reestablish a connection from previous lives. Now, if Abhiṣeka is an empowerment to meditative or ritual performance that does not actually implicate ritual action, we must ask, what exactly is it empowering a disciple to do? Right? All right. So let's quickly run down some of the structure of the most advanced Abhiṣeka rituals in India, probably known to many of you, but just to be sure. There was the disciple Abhiṣeka, the Vajrashishya Abhiṣeka, or the entry of the naif, the Balapravesha. It involved a water consecration, a crown consecration, conferring the disciple the scepter, the bell consecration, and conferring a new name. These 5 generally identified with the 5 Buddhas of the older mandalas, Vairocana, Akshobhya, Ratnasambhava, Amitabha, and Avogasiddhi. Now sometimes there is a 6th Abhiṣeka identified as the consecration, of the 5 forms of gnosis, which are identified with those Buddhas: the pure gnosis, or the Dhammadhatu, the mirror-like gnosis, the gnosis of equanimity, the inspection gnosis, and the gnosis that is capable of performing everything. But this Abhiṣeka is sometimes classed with the higher Abhiṣeka forms as well. And there's the higher Abhiṣeka, sometimes called the master or the inner. There's the Kalasha Abhiṣeka, which is the aggregation of all of the previous ones, sometimes with others added in. There's the Guhya Abhiṣeka. The disciple offers the teacher a female with whom the teacher has intercourse, giving the disciple the ejaculate as bodhicitta, the thought of awakening. There's the Prajnana Abhiṣeka. Under the guidance of the teacher, the disciple has intercourse with a female companion, experiencing various states of bliss. And finally, the Chaturtha Abhiṣeka, the 4th consecration, variously interpreted, but often signifying an explanation of the meaning of the previous consecration. Abhiṣeka manuals of the advanced form generally add some other consecrations, variously identified. The Vajravali of Abhyakarabhuta, for example, includes other consecrations: garland, master, and mirror. There's no one all-encompassing list of Abhiṣekas, and it is a category that is proven astonishingly elastic. So, what are the functions observable in Abhiṣeka that makes it so sticky? Why does it stick around? I propose to review some of these from the obvious to the less so, with the understanding that some of them overlap. Abhiṣeka functions. First is that is experience and memory. The panegyrics Abhiṣekas operate as an inflection points in the person receiving it, as a rite of passage in his experience of change. These factors create experience and memory. The panegyrics to one's own teacher, exemplified by the Guru Panchika Stotra, combined with the panegyrics to the teachers of the lineage, are understood as connected through the consecration ritual. Hagiographical statements from the saints of the past about their relationships with their teachers rely on that fact. And the occasional fictitious lineages that are generated to support this ideology of a less circuitous ritual event in some ways echo the Upasampanna ordination and the centrality of the Pratimoksha in Nikaya Buddhism. All of these forge metaphorical kinship lines, and that was how it was explained, for example, in the Milinda Panna. Permission and promotion. Analogous to the function of other rituals of passage, Abhiṣekas denoted change of status and an acceptance of new rights and responsibilities, as do rites of passage generally. Candidates receive permission to practice secret mantras, sadhanas, homas, mandalas, etc. Extending from that point, Abhiṣekas further denotes specific announcements to the larger community that these persons received approval to partake in and eventually conduct specific events. This idea is patterned after the grand mythic moment in the Sarvatathagata Tattva Sangraha, in which the Bodhisattva Samattabhadra becomes transformed into the Bodhisattva Vajrapani and into the position of the Chakravartin, the universal rulers for all the Tathagatas, by having them consecrate him through the jewel, the crown, and the turban Abhiṣekas, and magically press a Vajra scepter into his hand so that he is announced by all the Tathagatas as Vajrapani. The importance of this mythic event is such that the textual section is renewed at the beginning of the Vajrapani Abhiṣeka Tantra. Samya, vows and sacred elements. The Abhiṣeka rite of passage, as is well known, obligates the disciple to specific samyas, practices that employ the language of contract, which is the epigraphical and legal meaning of the term samya, a term that is polysemic. It is signifying occasion, opportunity, contract, sacred items, etc. Most of the time, the samya agreement is not revealed until after the Abhiṣeka, which is less than transparent, but in fact similar to the rules of the Vinaya, which are to be formally discussed following ordination. While some of the samyas are symbolic, generally they are social functional. Not to disparage the teacher, not to fight in the Ganachakra gathering, not revealing the secrets as explained in the Abhiṣeka, not disparaging fellow Abhiṣeka disciples, and so on. It may be observed that, like Abhiṣeka, samya is a moving target, consistently reimagined into the present. Confession, apathy. And because it is the nature of human beings not to live up to their agreements, necessarily there are confession rituals. that obligate the person to making puja offerings or in extreme cases reconsecration by the same master. Confession rites in both Shramana and Brahminical circles certainly precede Buddhism. And Buddhist institutions have inevitably instituted those rites and expiation behaviors following them for the purpose of atonement. Here, however, the overlap with confession rituals is less apparent in the case of the earlier Buddhist Deshanal rites of the Sarvanabhasattama Sutta or other systems than in the ritual-bound Prayaschitta of both the Vedic rites and the Brahminical Dharma Shastras. Competitive reply to Smarta, Shaiva, Vaishnava, and magical groups. Now, it cannot be, as has sometimes been claimed for Vajrayana rites, that Abhiṣeka is an imitation of Shaiva or Vaishnava ritual, since the initiation ritual of those systems, Diksha, is quite different, involving a metaphor of the destruction and recreation of the body and the person through the infusion of the person into a fire or a thread, which is then destroyed in fire, followed by the reformulation of the individual through the samskara rituals of personhood among the twice-born. We don't see any of this in Abhiṣeka. This is all in accord with the ideology of samskara, these refinement rituals for the twice-born, generally based on the belief of the rebirth and recreation of the person through the home of fire, a model event evident since the time of the Purusha Sukta, the Rig Veda in 1090. Buddhist Abhiṣeka is not a ritual of rebirth, but a ritual based in models of purification or in vivification. The person is not displaced, but purified and infused with vitality or infused with divinity, as the Rajabhisheka, the king's consecration, makes clear. The relationship of these sectarian groups to the emerging ideology of Diksha is more complex than some of our colleagues in those studies would have us believe, and I can go into detail should anyone wish. But it is true that increased competition from various groups sponsoring new application of the older ritual required Buddhists to cultivate clients previously not included. And those especially were involved seeking magical powers or those wishing to exercise a Buddhist version of the Vedana literature, this supplementary domestic literature. Pragmatics of Abhiṣeka. This gets with issue of linguistic use. So this is based on J.L. Lawson's How Do You Do Things with Words, and this most particularly a set of analyses from John Searle, and I wrote a 100-page article on this, applying that. I applied it at the time to Dhananese, now I'm applying it to Tantric. Literature emphasizes performance and the power of the speech act. So Abhiṣeka is, among other things, a ritual performance. It involves speech acts. It makes assertions considered true, generally associated with the nature of reality, the nature of Buddhas, etc. It affirms commissives on the part of a process of vows or commitment to the ritual. So the Sisha is told what to perform. He applies Evam Karishyami, I will do as directed. The Acharya is promising to teach. We have directives as instructions for the disciple to follow, and these three may be seen together. Come, son, I will instruct you in the method of practice and mantras according to the Mahayana. We have declaratives to the individual or the group announcing a ritual moment. We have expressive statements, such as the very well-known statement by a disciple that she has become fully human by this ritual. This is a statement that goes back to early Mahayana. Adyame sapalam janma sapalam jivitam chaime adya buddha kule jato buddha asmi sampratam. Today my birth is fulfilled, my life is also. I am born into the family of the Buddha. Just now I am a son of the Buddha. When we recall that the Vedas, the Brahmanas, and the early Buddhist literature had a well-known statement, a system of statement of truth, Satyavachana or Satyakriya, which could change the course of reality, we may appreciate why the functions of such speech acts are important to consider. And I would even say that speech acts in the history of Buddhism have changed the reality of Buddhism. And so that is an accurate assessment of speech acts. Relationships. In addition to, with the completion of the Abhiṣeka, if there are more than one person, or if there are others in the community that have received the same Abhiṣeka from the same teacher or lineage, then there are internal networks and relationships that are formed. Now, this is particularly true for the esoteric tradition with its indications of secrecy. For few things in the world are as evocative as secrecy per se. We may doubt that the secrets were actually kept in any significant way, as lists of transgressions all start with and generally mention the revelation of secrets as a transgression, which would not have happened had secrets been kept. However, the aura of secrets is as important as the secrets itself, which tend in most cases to be somewhat banal, the deities of the mandala, the specific mudras, etc. We may in fact surmise that the primary purpose of secrets is for the internal network of relationships to form an inner core of individuals harboring the esoteric lore. Those relationships were sufficiently important that the tension in the relationships is prohibited in both lists of offenses that aggregate the tantric precepts. So the Sambuddha, for example, indicates the teacher should not be disparaged and Vajra brothers should not be treated with dishonor. Networks. Internal relationships and their networks also signify the possibility of external relationships in their networks. Part of the reason why that places like Bodhimanda, Kanheri, Nalanda, Vikram, and Shila were so important is that these centers had relationships with other smaller temples and monasteries. Their relationships were facilitated by common bonds, and by 8th century, those networks became, in many cases, redefined through the esoteric system. The networks did not simply extend to the body of disciples of various related teachers, but to the monastic and lay support personnel invested in the materials required for the Abhiṣeka: painters, purveyors of materials for colors, pot makers, dealers in metal, bronzesmiths, dealers in exotic resins, fragrances, woods required for incense, dealers in material medica for the treatment of diseases a disciple may have, and so forth. The Mahavajracana Sutra, for example, has an extensive list of requirements: exotic flowers and garlands, expensive unguents, incense, cooked fruits, pastries, cakes, fruits, sweets, milks, curds, lamps, 18 kalasha flasks, silk pennants, parasols, bells, nets of gems, and other items in profusion. And that is not unique. Most tantras indicate a lengthy shopping list for the Abhiṣeka ceremony and make allowances for those with fewer funds. So if you don't have a kalasha flask made out of solid gold, I mean, does anyone, right? You don't have one, right? Then use silver or copper. But if necessary, you can take an earthen flask and put a little gold foil on it. That'll be good. If the candidates have insufficient funds, lay supporters may feed the community during the large ceremony, pay the cooks and bakers and vegetable and meat and liquor sellers, providing repast for the ceremony. There will be banners to be made, new silks from the mandala, pots and plates of various kinds and various compositions required. Ritual arrows will be provided if the mandala or the Abhiṣeka requires arrows, which some do. There's one thing that we know about social networks, ladies and gentlemen, especially networks among minority communities in India. They are sticky. They are sticky. Their stickiness is facilitated by personal introductions and recommendations, by commercial relationships, by exclusive and proprietary trades, by a consistent sense of threat to that community, by the majority community around them, and by reputation and access. So I mentioned Dr. Naroja's father, who I met, and all of a sudden I got sucked into the Shakya network. I loved it. It was fabulous. It was fabulous. But it was a real gang, right? It was a gang, right? Once you're in, you can't leave. Ritual activities. An analogous social function extends from the Abhiṣeka is a seemingly pedestrian ideology of various tantric karmas, and this is foregrounded in some tantras, such as the Paramadhya. The usual four, the Shantika or pacification, Paustika, augmentation, Vashikarana, control, and Avitara, violence, are in fact categories of ceremonies which are collected in an ever-increasing series of potential applications. To give you an example, pacification may refer to the elimination of disease, the suppression of events like fire, pacification of bad omens, purification of social elements, and so forth. While some Abhiṣeka texts specify that the purpose of the rite should not be miraculous powers, the siddhis, other texts are straightforward that Abhiṣeka opens the door to such practices. Accomplishment of the Abhiṣeka and a recommendation of the teacher allows the disciple to make a living. working for patrons and solving problems of childbirth, prognostication, pacification of water sources, control of enemies, control of nagas for rain, elimination of the demons of hail, and many other elements of great utility in a rural environment that allowed Buddhist tantrikas to pursue a livelihood in competition with magicians and physicians within their neighborhood. Reinforcing received social order and its norms. Examining Buddhist institutions for the last 50 years, I've been consistently impressed that Buddhists actually seldom seek to challenge the norms of the societies around them in a way that would satisfy the social justice warriors of the United States. The virtually complete capture of the Druku reincarnation system by the aristocratic clans of Tibet, the traditional Japanese representation that Tendai, an esoteric tradition, is for the imperial court, Shingon, an esoteric tradition, is for the nobility, Zen for the warrior class, and Pure Land for the masses, the active seeking of patronage from Chinese emperors by the Kagyu, Sakya, and others, all build on what we know from the activity in Naropa and his involvement with Bengali political figures. Indeed, the alignment of esoteric practice and wealthy and powerful seeking their intercession into worldly affairs is so common that it scarcely needs attention. The support of Tibetan Buddhism by a section of the Chinese moneyed classes today stands as an example. Chinese money classes fuel most of the donations to Tibetan Buddhism today. Consequently, a bright line has not been drawn between a form of Buddhism that employs a coronation ceremony, Abhiṣeka, and elevates disciples to spiritual kingship, and the patronage of actual kings, or those who stand as their proxies in the commercial world. That patronage does not come without certain encumbrances and the expectation of reciprocity. As I have pointed out before, the relations of the mandala provide a symbolic description of a diffused feudal system. And at least some of the 11th century Tibetan Lotsawa translators employed their charisma and authority to exercise political power in their valleys. The required fealty through gifts to the religious leader is delineated in works like the Vairochanagi Sambodhi, which indicates that the presents be given to the teacher include gold, silver, jewels, horses, and elephants, camels, cows, buffaloes, clothing, and so forth. All with the understanding that disciples will receive more via the magic of the mandala, which they can use as a vehicle for the aggregation of more donations. Abhiṣeka is a collecting point and a sorting system for rituals. The image of Abhiṣeka in Buddhist texts is that of a right to introduce the disciple to the spectrum of ritual behavior, including the tantric karmas previously mentioned. But the mechanism it employs to get there is in fact peculiar, and I have not seen the like elsewhere in ritual studies, although there may be others. Abhiṣeka rituals aggregate practices, pre-existing practices, under the guise of providing their introduction. What does that mean? It means prior to their employment in Abhiṣeka, we find specific practices observed either inside or outside of Buddhist institutions. At some point, we subsequently see those same practices included within an Abhiṣeka ritual, which has been enlarged to contain them. I can mention a few examples. The use of a mirror, Darpanabhiṣeka, and divination is an old tradition. It's mentioned in the Digha, for example. Employing generally a prepubescent girl who will be possessed by a spirit, look into a mirror and read omens, which will indicate the answer to a question. She is an oracle, in other words. We encounter it in early tantras as a standalone ritual. By late Indian Buddhism, it has become its own Abhiṣeka. A crown would seem to be necessary for coronation, but there's actually no crown mentioned in the Brahminical Rajasuya coronation rites. Consecration is done through a gold metal disc called a rukma, which is drilled with either 9 or 100 holes. There is another rukma on which the king stands. It's a golden sandwich, if you will. The Makuta crown, often with the older pata or Snisha turban, is encountered in epic and early Vedic supplemental literature, like the Baudhayana Gurshya Parishishta, as well as through later Puranas. Mahayana Buddhists had already developed a ritual with a crown. But the opposite direction, the Dharma Banika would have a crown tied to his head by the community after he had given a stirring presentation. He was, in effect, the crown prince of the Buddha, and we begin to see at this time crowned Buddhas as well. The ultimate logic in Tantric Abhisheka is similar, but one that establishes a religious lineage instead of popular acclaim. Instead of lauding the teacher and giving him a crown, now it becomes a lineage in which the crown is given from teacher to disciple. Now the disciple receives the crown from the Acharya in the manner that the crown prince receives the crown from the king. Sacramental sexuality precedes Tantrism and is relatively well established. The Chandogya Upanishad and Aranyaka, to cite only the best known, mention sexuality as the internalization of the home of fire. Sacramental sexuality is seen in the 6th chapter of the Kosha Samaja, as pointed out by Isaacson. Consequently, the employment of sexuality in a sacramental capacity was established prior to the formalized inclusion of the Kosha Abhisheka, even if it became most noted in that application. Conclusion. Abhisheka is as sticky as optional soteriological rituals come. First from its first recorded event in 651 to the present. In the process, Abhisheka operates with both stickiness and elasticity, fulfilling functions both personal and social, establishing narrative memories, invoking commitments and confessions, employing an ideology of statements of truth in various pragmatic forms, creating new internal and external networks, supporting received social hierarchies, all the while functioning with an exceptional elasticity to include rituals that have become assessed as important to the emergent tradition, for whatever reason. I cannot pretend that I have done anything other than gesture towards these many difficult issues, but hopefully scholarship on Abhisheka will uncover more than the small amount I have discussed today. So I want to thank you all for indulging my behavior, and thank to Dr. Niro Shakya and the administration of University of the West.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ronald Davidson, for an outstanding lecture on initiation of Abhisheka in Indian Buddhism. And your insight and systematic explanation, you covered so many things, semantics, lower and higher Abhiṣekas, pragmatic Abhiṣeka, and also the function of Abhiṣeka, so it's very illuminating. And those were incredibly valuable, and we deeply appreciate the time and effort you put into sharing this knowledge with us today. So now we will take some question and answer, question from the audience.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mr. Davidson, for such a wonderful presentation. I'm looking forward to reading the full chapter in my book.
The chapter doesn't include some of them, about half the material I presented today is new.
Oh wow, that's great to know. It's okay. It's all good. Thank you. I would
Say
like
loud.
to know. Yes. I would like to know if Abhiṣekas are always considered a part of some other rituals, or they can be sort of standalone.
Oh, they're standalone. They're standalone. There's usually some Buddhist charana, there's some introduction and taking refuge and Bodhisattva vows and stuff of that nature, right? But the Abhisheka is the big event. That's usually what's happening. And if you go to these big Abhishekas, like the Kalachakra Abhisheka, for example, the Rinchen Tezu, which could take months, right? I mean, you have months to just sit there receiving these Abhishekas, because it's an Abhisheka into the entire Theravada tradition, the entire buried text tradition of Tibetan Buddhism up to the time of the late 19th century with Kongtrul Tataya. So there's hundreds of Abhishekas, right? So Abhisheka is definitely a standalone event.
Because I've been working in Kriya Sangraha Manjika, and
Yeah.
there's a set of 10 rituals, Dasha Kriya, Dasha Karma, which is a sort of life cycle rituals.
Oh yeah.
And then at the end, after the 10th one, we see descriptions of Abhishekas. And so I was wondering if they should be treated as part of the life cycle rituals, or as a separate section, so to speak?
Okay, so let's cut real quick to Brahminical categories of rituals, right? Okay, so life cycle rituals are called Naimittika in the Grihya literature. I got one right here, thank you. In the Grihya literature, right? So they are Naimittika. Naimittika ritual is a ritual which you are expected to undergo because of your position in society and your gender, right? So Upasampada, not Upasampada, I would say Upanayana ceremony, right? Among the male in the twice-born calves, right? Okay. So that's a Naimittika ritual. You have daily rituals, the Agnishtoma, for example, or the Vaishvideva rituals among the Brahmins. That's a daily ritual, Nitya. So Nitya, Naimittika, and then you have Kamya. Kamya is an optional ritual. All your soteriological rituals are Kamya, right? They're all optional, right? And the Buddhists don't emulate that language, but particularly in Nepal, they emulated this structure, right? I don't know if they emulate the language, but I think they've emulated the structure, right? And so what is interesting about Abhiṣeka is that none of those life cycle rituals were maintained specifically by Buddhist monks or within Buddhist traditions, right? So there's no manual in India, as there is in Nepal. There's no manual in India for daily ritual, right? There's no manual for life cycle ritual. If you take Abhiṣeka as a Kamya ritual, some Abhiṣeka traditions have a samaya, have a promise that you're supposed to say mantras every day, or you're supposed to visualize the deity every day, or you're supposed to constantly visualize yourself as the deity. It depends entirely on the nature of the Abhiṣeka. But that's the difference, right? So Abhiṣeka is a Kamya, it is an optional ritual, right? Because, some Buddhists become hunters or, fishers or whatever, right? Or they go into the military, and that's what they do. They're not going to be involved necessarily in the ritual system associated with the soteriological function.
Thank you, very helpful.
Okay. That works.
Hi, Professor. I think that I'm kind of shocked after the presentation. Because everything I know about Buddhism, you're talking about one of the difference between Buddhism and the other religions, because the Buddhas always promote the ideal that we're talking about is no discrimination. We're talking about no caste system, right? But in your analysis, at least in the Tantric Buddhism, you come up with an example. You compare the relation between the master and the disciple. It's similar to the relation between the crown prince and king.
Yeah.
So in that sense, at least the Tantric Buddhism is promoted a new class. In which class they're looking for power and all kind of authority. So how can a branch of Buddhism fit into the general Buddhism philosophy? We're talking about we don't have any discrimination, but now this particular branch promote a new class.
I told you there would be cognitive dissonance. Okay, so your point is well taken, but let's parse some stuff out first. Okay, let's parse some stuff out. One of the things that parsed out is that there were always acharyas within Buddhism, great teachers, and those great teachers stood above the others, either within the monastery or outside of the monastery. And there was some friction about this. We read within some of the early Mahayana scriptures, for example, that we have some friction between those who are teachers within the monasteries and those who are teachers to the greater populace. So Buddhist tradition has always established a degree of hierarchy. It's just not caste bound. Okay? The model of the Abhiṣeka is a model of symbolic kingship. And it is a model worked around this notion of symbolic kingship. These people aren't real kings. They don't make their own money. They don't make their own laws. They don't kill people. They don't have their children pass on their stuff. So it's a model of kingship that operates symbolically. That's what it does. And so in the same way, right, we see among the Mahayanist scriptures, we have models of the Bodhisattva operating as a Sartavaha, the caravan leader. So a caravan leader is still a leader. Those people follow him. If you don't have a caravan leader, you don't know where the water sources are or where the track leads, and you might get lost in the woods. Right? So leadership has been part of the time since the time of the Buddha. Otherwise, there would not be the leadership established by the Arhat. The idea that Buddhism is without all hierarchy is simply false. It's always been hierarchical, and it's always going to be hierarchical. But the hierarchy is not established based on birth, based on ability, right? Okay, so that means who gets to receive Abhiṣeka from a teacher, right? And that's where the issue of discrimination may or may not happen. And the texts are divided in that. Do you examine whether the student is a good student or not? Generally you do. And I'll tell you right now, I don't want bad students in my classroom. But the Sarvadhyaka Tattva Samgraha, which is one of the most influential of all tantras, has a section in there in which it says, no, you're never to examine whether the disciple is bhajana, and that's a technical term. You use it as a vessel, or is this disciple a vessel for the teaching? And it just discusses why is this the case? And the reason why it gives that this is the case is because even if the disciple goes and breaks all of the vows and just screws up left, right, and center, it will bury the seed of Buddhahood within that individual, and that may mature later on. Right? So that indicates that there's some division of opinion about those who are appropriate and inappropriate. But I'll tell you right now, there are sections in the Mahayana Sutras that simply say if the person in front of you is a Shravaka, Mahashravaka, you don't discuss the Mahayana Sutras with them because it will cause them a loss of faith. Right? They have to be bhaja. They have to be vessels for it. In the same way that anyone trying to teach me advanced physics would just lose me. It would be a waste of their time and a waste of my time, right? I never pursued advanced mathematics, and advanced physics would be completely flat, right? Okay, so to go back to the question, all Buddhist monasteries have an educational component. Buddhism is the first religious tradition that is based on an idea that the cosmic problem is ignorance. And as a consequence, it has made education part of its dynamic. Because otherwise you're not going to have insight based on hearing, shrutamayi prajna, insight based on ruminating on it, chittamayi prajna, and insight based on meditating on it, bhavanamayi prajna. And so those hierarchies of form, and that's what they are, they're hierarchies of form, are required for a student. You have to have someone who's a leader, and you have to have someone who's led. Okay? So what the Tantrikas are doing is they're divorcing coronation from those people who would normally have it, which would be predominantly Kshatriya and Brahmana traditions. They're taking it out and making it available as a symbolic soteriological form for others. Right. Okay. The content of the higher Abhiṣekas using sexuality, that was almost entirely relegated to the laity. Right. And for about 2 centuries, 8th and 9th centuries, Tantric Buddhism was almost entirely a lay operation. And in Tibet, from the 10th to the 12th century, was almost entirely lay operation. Right? It wasn't monastic, it was lay. But we know that some monastic people were interested in this. Otherwise, Atisha would not have written the concluding section of his Bodhisattva Pradipika, in which he says, no, you'll get access to all of the higher tantras by means of the lower initiations. You don't need the higher initiations. And no monk should ever engage in sexuality. And if you read my article on Abhiṣekas, you'll see that issue of sexuality became so conflicted. And ever since the 13th century, those kinds of initiations are supposed to be done visually, not physically. They are done envisioned. Right? And so for the Buddhists, that's entirely fine. Why? Because in the Bodhisattva vow, in the Vajracharya Pranidhana Raja, for example, it says, I will offer everything in my mind and in fact. And so making offerings and performing actions within your mind, because karma is chetana, it is mental. Right? Just as I pointed out in the Abhidhamma Kosha. Right? And so, because karma is mental, therefore, all of those actions may be done in your mind. Does that answer your question? It's kind of a long way around, but I wanted to hit all the high points.
So in Nepal, also same thing like that. No, I was born in a Sakya family. Still, I am not qualified to take initiation. I need to get training, study, and then teacher will decide I am qualified or not. That's not discrimination. It's just qualification. I do have personal
and motivation.
Yeah, motivation.
Yeah, motivation.
It's not like in Hinduism, like a caste system.
No.
You are not allowed to talk.
Right. And we have to say that Tantric Buddhists there are two times in Buddhist history in which Buddhists proselytized tribal peoples in India, and one was in Tantric Buddhism. Right? We find Shaivadas as a sort of blanket term for tribal peoples, Shaivadas as this group of people that the Buddhists were invested in. And that's part of the reason, I will point this out, part of the reason why Buddhists and Buddhists alone began to use vernacular literature in India, Bengali, and then Braj Bhasha and various other sorts of vernacular literatures in India to write some of this Charyagiti material, some of these songs of realization. Nobody else is doing it. The Buddhists are doing that, so people could understand it. Take it out of the Sanskritic archive, put it into a vernacular idiom.
Can we take one more last question? Question?
Please excuse my question. I'm a bit new to this aspect of Buddhist studies. But I was interested in the slide in which you were sharing the differences with Abhiṣekas and the Vedic initiation traditions.
Ah.
And I was wondering if you could say more about those differences.
Sure. So the Vedic initiation system is done for the rebirth of the individual, right? Those Diksha systems start off to take the patron, the Yajamana, in a ritual like the Agnichayana, the Shrauta ritual, right? You take the Yajamana, and then you symbolically destroy him. Symbolically his body goes into the fire by means of clothing, for example, and that sort of destruction. If you become a sannyasi, a sadhu in India, you go through that same ritual, right? You go and you take off your clothing and you throw it in the fire, right? That idea of diksha as a recreation of the individual. You shave your head, right? So you're newborn. In the Vedic circumstance, they actually hold up a piece of cloth that you, as the patron of the ceremony, you're supposed to go through, right? So you have this symbolic rebirth in which you see yourself being reborn. And then they have to give you all of the samskaras all over again, because now you're newborn, right? You got to get all your impressions all over again. There's nothing like that in Abhiṣeka, right? So Abhiṣeka is an infusion, is purification and infusion, that's what it is, right? So it purifies the individual as a stream of being and infuses that individual with the vitality of the divinity, most particularly Vajrasattva, right? Or Vajrapani, right? infuses those vitalities into the individual, the bodhisattva into the individual. The the individual becomes that bodhisattva. Right? Not reborn as it, but he fuses with that bodhisattva. Okay? And so none of the symbolic systems associated with rebirth are found there. Right? There is a symbolic association of rebirth within, not Abhiṣeka, but within the Utpatikrama section of the higher tantras, in which you envision yourself completely eliminated and reborn as Vairochana or whatever. Right? But that's not done in the Abhiṣeka, and that's not ceremony. That's entirely envisioned. Right?
Thank you very much.
Once again, heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Ronald Davidson for delivering a wonderful talk today. And also thank you all attending. And may you have a delightful evening. And let's give a round of applause.